What I'm going to be talking about today is about how to couple together probabilistic graphical models, which is a very successful machine learning sort of paradigm from the distant past of like 5 or 6 years ago, with the modern sort of view on deep learning and the construction of neural networks. And I'm going to motivate this by starting out talking about some science that we've been trying to do in collaboration with some folks at the Harvard Medical School over the last couple of years. And this is about modeling mouse behavior. We use mice to understand lots of different things about people. And the core kind of question that we want to be able to answer is, if we say give this mouse a drug or modify its genes or stimulate its brain in some interesting way, how does its behavior change? And this lets us do science, lets us discover drugs, and hopefully translate interesting things about mouse behavior to the way that humans behave. Now, traditionally, the way this has been done has been to turn the problem into something that's very simple, to try to take the complicated mouse and turn it into essentially kind of a scalar that summarizes all of its behavior. So this is called an elevated plus maze, and the idea here is that when a mouse is more anxious, it doesn't want to spend as much time out on this exposed portion of this maze, and so you can take a mouse, look at the fraction of time that it spends out on that, and sort of summarize all of its behavior as that one sort of fraction. Okay, that's a very simple scalar explanation of all of mouse behavior. But of course, that's not very satisfying because mice aren't simple, right? They do lots of different things. They explore. They're quite smart, right? And the whole point is to be able to understand the complexity of this behavior so that we can understand the complexity of human behavior. In the sort of modern world, though, we have lots of great stuff going on in terms of complex models, fast computation, and better instrumentation. And so the agenda here is how do we use this kind of, all of this kind of great advances in order to do better science and ask better questions about these guys. This is an example of some of the data that we study. What you're seeing is a depth camera, so like a Kinect of a freely behaving mouse. So rather than a synthetic, very simple view on the mouse, we have we're just letting the mouse do whatever it wants and building a sort of a 2.5D representation, so a depth map. Ideally, what we want to be able to do is to learn a sort of a language of behavior of the mice across the population, and then understand how that's modulated. So we imagine that mice are explained by latent states that are sort of discrete. That is, there's different behaviors that the mouse sort of undergoes. There's some dynamics over these discrete behaviors, and they can kind of summarize all, they can kind of summarize everything that the mouse gets up to. And we view this through the sort of the lens of thinking about trying to discover language in a sense from scratch from raw waveforms. You could imagine, language has of course, a lot of structure, grammar, sort of syntax, semantics, lots of interesting structure, and that is somehow encoded in a raw waveform of a bunch of speech. How would we go from those kind of raw signals to the interesting and interpretable discrete structure? We want to do the same thing here, where we want to go from sort of raw depth video to a representation of this kind of grammar of mouse behavior. Then the idea being, if we have such an unsupervised representation of what the mouse is doing, then if we shine a laser into its brain or modify its genes or expose it to fox pheromone or whatever it is, then we can ask how that modulates different kinds of behaviors without having a human in the loop. So that's the big sort of like thing to contrast this with, is the idea that what you might have done previously was have a grad student label a bunch of frames of video of what the mouse is doing. And it turns out that the sort of inter-observer error rate of that is something like 60%. And moreover, it requires sort of thinking about what the mouse is doing on human timescales and using human language. And that's a sort of very anthropocentric view of what a mouse's behavior could be. And we'd like to sort of be able to remove those humans and ask sort of the mouse what it wants to do on timescales that don't necessarily have to be relevant to humans. So if we're going to sort of model a mouse in terms of using something like a probabilistic model with unsupervised learning, then one of the kind of approaches that we like to think about is to model it as something like a switching linear dynamical system. So this is taking seriously the idea that there's some set of discrete latent states with some interesting dynamics over them, the thing that we want to be able to interpret. And we're going to be able to then try to sort of take those discrete states, map them to a continuous linear dynamical system that is encoding somehow the kind of the mouse physics, if you will, the joint angles and so on, as sort of conditioned on this discrete state, right? So that is the different kinds of behavior, rearing and so on, correspond in this case to some kind of local linear dynamical system. Then so we can write that as probabilistic graphical model with both discrete and continuous states. And ultimately, we want to add some interesting sort of high-level parameters and then map those down to the actual pixels that we see, right? So this is a kind of like, in some ways, kind of a signal processing view on how to deal with mice. We're using something that maybe isn't so different from other kinds of very successful decoding algorithms, Kalman filtering, and other things. But the problem, of course, is that we have very high-dimensional data. And if you've tried to fit these kinds of models before, where maybe you have Gaussian observations to something as high dimensional as depth camera data, then you can probably appreciate that this is very likely to fail simply because of the dimensionality. So we've got to come up with some kind of more interesting and interpretable model, or not, rather a model that's going to be hopefully still interpretable, still have interesting discrete structure, but be able to explain these high dimensional data. So you can think of this as kind of a spectrum of different ways you might approach the sort of the scientific problem of modeling mouse behavior. At sort of one basic level, a traditional approach would be to take something, this very, very complicated time series, boil it off into one number, like what fraction of the time is the mouse spinning on this elevated plus maze. And then, of course, simple data only allows us to have simple hypotheses. Another approach you might take in sort of light of the modern interest in neural networks is to say, well, this is a time series, it's high dimensional. I'm just going to take my favorite recurrent neural network, yada, yada, and throw it at this problem. And it will get very good, say, at predicting the next frame that you see in the sequence. But this doesn't necessarily give us a lot of scientific insight into what's going on inside the mouse's head. What we'd like to find is some kind of intermediate place where we can use the sort of nice interpretable structure of something like a probabilistic graphical model, but take advantage of modern developments in neural networks in order to be able to explain the high-dimensional data. I think of this as being a kind of a semi-parametric model. So non-parametric models are models that are massively parameterized, and I think neural networks are an example of this. A semi-parametric model is one that couples sort of interpretable and identifiable structure against and couples that with some very, very flexible, model to take care of what we might think of as nuisance parameters. So the way to think about kind of what we're trying to do here is to imagine kind of a very simple cartoon data set like this. So imagine that every one of these points is like a frame of mouse video. And here we see some very clear discrete structure, but also some possibly difficult to model nonlinear structure. And you could imagine taking a kind of a classic approach to this in which we use something like a flexible, non-parametric, Gaussian mixture model. And we try to infer the number of components maybe and allow it to sort of come up with a density estimate that is going to tile these Gaussians sort of all over these data. And it can do a good job of capturing all of the structure, but because the Gaussian distribution isn't flexible enough, then what's going to happen is we're going to sort of lose the structure we want to see because it's going to sort of over-segment these data. At the other extreme, we could imagine using something like a variational autoencoder or your favorite neural density estimator and do the same kind of thing where we're taking some simple distribution, using a neural network to warp it in such a way that it models the density. And again, we're able to do a good job capturing the mass, but we're going to lose sort of interesting interpretability here because it's just a bunch of sort of density goo. What we want to do is hit a sweet spot between these things where we're able to take advantage of the neural network's flexibility to come up with sort of relatively complicated density models for the individual components, but still retain that discrete structure. So this is the kind of sweet spot we're trying to hit, and you can think about applying this to lots of different domains. We've heard a lot about embedded devices like Fitbits and things where you could imagine trying to capture nonlinear structure in the data, but ultimately you want to map that into a discrete representation that you can use at other stages of your processing pipeline. So to achieve this kind of flexibility, we can take advantage of rich function approximators in the form of neural networks on at least two different sides. So one is to come up with very flexible likelihoods that take a relatively low-dimensional Gaussian representation, say, in a switching linear dynamical system, and map that to high-dimensional depth pixels. But it's also going to turn out that in order to do inference in a complicated model like this, we can take advantage of neural networks to find function approximations for a variational posterior approximation. So, and so that's what we'll call amortized inference because we're learning a sort of fixed approximation for doing our posterior distribution. So the point here is going to be that that probabilistic graphical models have been very, very successful in a lot of different domains, and we use them in all kinds of things from error correction to their sort of old school speech recognition, but the Kalman filtering, like these things are kind of everywhere. There's a lot of interesting sort of digital signal processing that's been baked, that sort of is very efficient for solving these kinds of problems. But then sort of complementary to that, we have a whole lot of great success in these very high-dimensional function approximators for neural networks that can do all that can take in images with COMNETs and produce interesting labels and so on. We want to figure out a way to plug these things together to get the best of both worlds, and so that's kind of what we're talking about here. So to get sort of into the details a little bit, we can take a model like this, and if we want to take the Gaussian observations that we have with the x's here and turn those into high-dimensional data, a natural way to do this is to use a neural network to parameterize the likelihood. So taking that latent structure and then sort of exploding that with a big neural network to parameterize the mean and the covariance of a Gaussian distribution over, say, the frames of these data. So this is a natural way to introduce a lot more parameters, still have a low-dimensional representation that's leading to this high-dimensional likelihood. And we can sort of bake this off in an abstract way by thinking not just about time series, but more general kinds of latent variable models. And sort of boil these off into the sort of simplest kind of structures that are going to take advantage of efficient probabilistic graphical model type structures with flexible neural networks. So you can think of the kind of model that we're going to talk about here as being something that's going to have an interesting sort of conjugate exponential family structure for a lot of latent variables that we want to be able to interpret with big flexible neural networks at the bottom that are going to actually connect to the data. This is an appealing thing to do because, again, probabilistic graphical models have been wildly successful and across a big variety of domains, from things like linear dynamical systems and Gaussian mixture models, but also things like canonical correlation analysis, mixtures of experts, lots of different kinds of things. So these are successful models that work in a lot of different kinds of areas. What we'd like to be able to do is have them work with fancy high-dimensional data, even when things don't look, say, very Gaussian or sort of very simple. Now, so that's kind of a way to specify the forward model, but if you've dealt with these kinds of things before, you can probably appreciate that everything I've said so far is kind of the easy part, and that the hard part of dealing with any kind of thing like this is necessarily figuring out how to do inference. And the kind of strategy that we're going to take in this is to think about mean field variational approximation. So all that means is we're going to approximate the posterior distribution with a factored distribution. And what that lets us do is turn the problem into an optimization problem rather than a traditional Bayesian inference integration type problem. And in particular, we're going to do this in such a way that we can use stochastic optimization techniques where we're going to be able to take advantage, in particular, of natural gradients and sort of make moves that reflect the kind of the underlying Riemannian metric. And for the pieces that are non-conjugate, we'll do amortized inference. So just to remind you exactly kind of what we're about here, the idea basically is that we have sort of three different kinds of data floating around: the stuff we've seen, the actual direct observables. We have a set of sort of local latent variables that might be something like what's the pose of the mouse in this frame, and then global variables that maybe describe the dynamics as well as the parameters of the neural network likelihood. And the idea, broadly speaking, is that we write down an approximating distribution, and we can find a lower bound on the marginal likelihood as a proxy that we can relatively easily optimize. What's really cool about this is that some recent advances in stochastic variational inference have made it possible to do this at larger scales than was previously possible. In particular, it turns out that you can take the problem that was previously framed in terms of both global and local variables and reparameterize that only in terms of these global variables. And that has the sort of surprising and interesting side effect that you can then take natural gradient steps just by looking at the expected sufficient statistics of those local variables. I'm obviously skipping a lot of details here, but I want to kind of give you the general flavor, where the point is that because we're operating entirely in terms of the global variables, then we can do things like take subsets or mini batches of data and compute the expected sufficient statistics for those and still be able to take stochastic natural gradient steps in a possibly big, interesting and big probabilistic graphical model. So the way this kind of works, broadly speaking, is we have some data. It gives us local potentials. They're essentially the likelihoods. And then we can use whatever our favorite sort of efficient message passing algorithm is from, maybe it's some kind of dynamic programming in order to compute these expected sufficient statistics. And then that tells us where to go when we compute the natural gradient. The catch, of course, is that in the kind of models we want to build here, everything's not going to be pretty in conjugate because we're hanging a giant neural network off of our likelihood. And in particular, what's going to happen is that when we try to compute those, that sort of variational posterior, it's going to be quite complicated. So a natural thing to do is to look at the data and try to use a function from the data with some interesting function approximator to actually estimate what that variational posterior distribution should be. And of course, quite conveniently, we have a very rich and successful class of function approximators, and these are deep neural networks. So what we can do is construct something that has come to be called a variational autoencoder. So an autoencoder is a kind of neural network that you maybe have seen before, where it's essentially trying to learn a function that corresponds to the identity function, but with a bottleneck in the middle so that it tends to learn some interesting compression. A variational autoencoder is a reinterpretation of that, where instead of the encoder learning a compression, the encoder is learning to represent a variational posterior distribution over latent variables, and then the decoder is taking that and trying to map that back to the data, the thing we've called the likelihood. So it's a very interesting sort of reinterpretation of the autoencoder that has a nice advantage that we can use this sort of this lower bound of the marginal likelihood as our training objective. So we can sort of think of a space then of different ways we could build probabilistic models using neural networks. On one end, we could imagine trying to handle things entirely in terms of stochastic variational inference. This is appealing because it lets us ask kind of arbitrary inference questions, gives us optimal local factors, and we can take advantage of the interesting graph structure in our probabilistic graphical model. But the downside is it's going to be slow in general because we have to do an inner loop optimization every time we want to ask a question about our data. At the other extreme, we could imagine doing everything with neural networks, constructing a variational autoencoder, which is going to be nice because it's going to be fast at test time. It's just a feed-forward variational approximation. But in general, it's going to be suboptimal and not allow us to ask general marginal questions about our data. So what we've been doing in this work, motivated by the mouse problem, is something we call a structured variational autoencoder that has both conjugate exponential family structure where it's appropriate and takes natural gradient steps in that part, but also uses amortized inference like a variational autoencoder for the bits that are non-conjugate in which you'd like to be able to do this amortized inference. So it kind of tries to use the natural gradient SVI where that's appropriate and try to use amortized inference like a variational autoencoder where that's appropriate. So the idea, again, we're going to sort of compute our evidence of potentials. Now this is arising from our neural network. Given that structure that we get from this decoder, this encoder, we're now able to use your favorite efficient message passing algorithms in order to compute the latent states. Now we can use this sort of reparameterization trick in order to compute flat gradients for the non-conjugate structure to take steps in those bits, and then we can take advantage of the expected sufficient statistics for the conjugate bits in order to take a step in those parameters. So it lets us kind of it turns out that we can kind of unify all of this in terms of proximal operators, which is some follow-on work, but the point is what we're really doing is just trying to decompose the problem into two kinds of optimization, one where we can take advantage of this sort of Riemannian metric that lives there, and the other taking advantage of things like the reparameterization trick. So here's an example, sort of back to this simple sort of pinwheel type data. Here's an example of what's going on when we train a model like this. So this is a simple Gaussian mixture model on a two-dimensional latent space, and this is in the observation space. And what you want to think about this doing is that the neural network is trying to learn a function between the spaces such that a simple Gaussian mixture model can fit. Okay, so simple Gaussian mixture doesn't fit to this, but there is some, hopefully, smooth map that causes a Gaussian mixture model to make sense. And so that's what it's trying to identify. But we can do kind of more interesting things as well. So here's a really simple sort of toy data set of a puck moving back and forth in a one-dimensional space. And so the model is now trying to learn not just kind of what the sort of the puck model is, but also the dynamics as it bounces off the edges of this little one-dimensional thing. So it gets to see what's going on up to the red, and then it's up to the red line, and then it's being asked to extrapolate what it thinks is going to happen. And what you'll notice is that it learns kind of a marginal model for the puck right away, and then it learns a simple latent dynamics that allows it to project what it's going to do. So it's trying to learn this simple local model as well as a graphical model that allows it to project forward. Back to the mouse data, the way we sort of think about this is we imagine that there's effectively in this high dimensional space of mouse videos, that's sort of a kind of low dimensional manifold that explains what the mouse can do, and that the dynamics of the mouse behavior are constrained to that manifold. So the mouse can't create all possible depth images, right? There's some very, very small set of depth images that the mouse can create, and there's some relatively constrained dynamics that we are calling behavior on that manifold. And what we're hoping to be able to do is to summarize all of these frames of video into a relatively simple and interpretable set of discrete dynamics. And when we do this, we can then go back and look at the mice, and somebody who knows a lot about mouse behavior can look at the segmentations that we get out and try to map that onto what we think we understand about the way mice behave. In this case, so this is real data, and when the white square comes on, that's the start of one of these syllables. In this case, it's something that we've labeled as a start rear, so this is where the mouse is kind of on all fours and then comes up. This is the kind of the opposite behavior where it was sort of standing up and it's falling down. This is where the mouse is kind of like bending over and grooming its tummy. And so we've then sort of been using this to inform different interesting studies and sort of thinking about, as I said, this is a collaboration with the Harvard Medical School, so the point of this ultimately is to be able to understand interesting structures in the brain. I'm not going to go into details about that because we're out of time, but what I'd like to do is kind of leave you with the following sort of overall message here, because I've talked a lot about mice specifically because I find that to be a motivating scientific application, but the picture you want to have in your head is that the history of machine learning, broadly speaking, has been about learning basis functions for supervised learning such that you get a linear classifier, right? If we go back and think about, all kinds of fancy methods, whether it's boosting or whether it's kernelized SVMs, the name of the game in general is find a basis such that you can take your nonlinear data and then a linear classifier will work. And in fact, that's what deep neural networks do also. If you think about the last layer of your favorite ImageNet classifier, that's still just a logistic regressor, right? And so that's been tremendously successful as a way to think about supervised learning and to turn complicated problems into problems for which we have very nice theoretical results. So what we're trying to do in this work is do the same thing, but in a sense for unsupervised learning, right? So we're trying to find a situation in which we have a basis such that a relatively simple, unsupervised, probabilistic sort of model, a model-based unsupervised learning method will work. Something like a mixture of Gaussians, but it could also be latent Dirichlet allocation or canonical correlation analysis, or whatever your favorite sort of unsupervised structure discovery is. So same kind of idea, find a basis in which a simple low-dimensional model works. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time.
Okay, so